Your rights are my responsibility. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. I'm not listening to your stupid classes.
Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, and we are just going to jump right into this issue. One of the scariest things is when people applaud the disruption and dismantling of the United States Constitution. They do this by saying that we're beyond the Constitution or we don't need the Constitution. They do this by enacting a new way of life in which they're going to put forth blasphemy laws and they're going to prosecute people who don't agree with their integralist system. You may be thinking to yourself, who in the world are you talking about? Well, if you've watched anything of the debates that have been taking place lately throughout social media, the progressive media, and in media in general, it's clearly this issue of what's going on with Christian nationalism. Are they for the Constitution or are they against the Constitution? Are these people in favor of putting in a theocracy or are they not? Can we actually believe what the pundits are saying about them? Or are these people and their words just being twisted and turned to every direction here, there, and more? Well, what I want to do today is I want to let these figures sort of speak for themselves. You know, I've talked about a whole host of things as it relates to how they're being, spun by the media and how I think the left is really controlling this entire narrative and that the right's getting caught up in it. I also think that there's a whole host of issues of articles being written and business dealings and property dealings and all the rest. And what I want to do today is I want to ground this concept in just this old thing that maybe your mother taught you or maybe your father taught you, that if you want to see what somebody believes, merely let them speak. And I think this is something that evangelicals, but even conservatives are slow to understand. When we're looking at these various totalitarian movements, these people are usually very, very clear in what they believe. And when you look at the great history of these kinds of movements, they're not sort of trying to hide this. They're very open about what they're trying to say. Now, what's been interesting about this whole Christian nationalist debate is that some of these figures have operated under sort of this moderate understanding of what they believe and what they don't believe. 2 years ago, if you would have said, well, these people are post-constitutional, they would have balked at the idea. They would have argued against the concept. Or if you would have said, these people are trying to have a theocracy and that they want to blasphemy laws, they would have immediately pushed back against you. The Twitter mob would have hit you and all the rest. But now what's interesting is that just like all of the others, they're starting to lay forth their case. So what I want to do here is I want to let many of these figures speak, and I'm going to look at different articles and a few of their posts on X/Twitter, and we're going to mine through a little bit of what's actually going on here. So in order to do this, I want to start out with a video from Jordan Peterson. And the reason that I'm picking this is I want you to think along the lines of what Peterson's going to say here. We've already hinted at it, but it's this idea of let them speak for themselves. So let's listen here.
Often the easiest way to find out what someone's up to is just to listen to what they say. They'll tell you. Hitler told everyone what he was up to. He wrote a whole book about it. Oh, no, he couldn't be up to that. It's like, yeah, pretty much he was up to that. These people who come out and say, we should burn everything to the ground and start again. It's like, that's what they mean. Oh, they don't really mean that. They don't mean that with equity. They don't mean equality of outcome. They don't really mean that. They mean it. They have sway online and far more.
And see, this is one of the things that I keep talking about as it relates to this whole debate over Christian nationalism. I like it under this idea that so many people have seen, and it's the story that I've always given when it comes to, a father talking about his daughter wanting to date. And, you listen to the father say, honey, what do you think about this guy that you're seemingly interested in? Oh, daddy, I am not interested in this guy. I have nothing, that I want to do with this guy. We're just friends. It's nothing more. Well, all the while, their actions say something different. And the old adage is don't listen to what they say, watch what they do. Because it starts out as, I want nothing to do with this guy, and yet their actions are saying that they're with this figure all the time. And then it's, well, we're just friends. And then before too long, the words end up matching the actions. And I think this is so much of what's going on here is that for a number of years, many of these figures, I mean, we're just going to be very clear. This is the post-liberal, this is the NatCon crew, this is the Christian Nationalist crew, this is the Society for American Renewal crew. They've been on this long march on what could be considered the Hegelian right of this, where they're working towards a post-constitutional age, and they're making business dealings along these lines. They're making fiscal sort of decisions based upon this lines. They're making this idea of a digital economy along these lines. And while their words for a number of years have been saying something different, their actions have been very clear about what they believe and where they're going. But interestingly enough, the shift has occurred and they're starting to say exactly what they believe. And I want to pull up this article here. And this article comes on the Christian Post, and it comes from this woman named Janet Metford. Sorry about that, guys. Got it pulled up here. And what it is it talks about the new Christian nationalism is in fact a woke right. Now, one of the things that she's getting at here is she says this: a few years ago, the word woke exploded into the American lexicon as leftist activists used it to describe a state of awareness concerning racial inequalities and social injustices. It didn't take long, though, for woke to become a dirty word. And we all understand that this whole idea of woke, well, what do you mean by woke? Is it this? Is it that? Saturday Night Live actually had one of the best skits about it where they made woke pants that could kind of fit anything and everything. But what it was this trap that was being used where we know what woke meant. Woke was, in one sense, as James Lindsay used to say, it is calling everything racist until you control it. It's this idea of using these power play dynamics for control. And you notice what she starts to talk about here. She says, as the movement evolved, critics rightly called out the woke left for using critical race theory to create a false framework of generalized oppressed versus oppressor, a worldview that informed subsequent developments such as diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, attacks on free speech, and draconian but baseless warnings about the threat of dangerous white Christian nationalists. Now, she goes on to say this: many white Americans also condemn the hypocrisy of the woke left for waving a banner of anti-racism while displaying its own race-based animus. This, as the drumbeat over the alleged danger of white Christian nationalism grew even louder, even as the only visible Christian nationalists at the time were largely a harmless hodgepodge of peaceful evangelical patriots and MAGA conservatives. Now, she goes on to say this: the insult was enough, though, to serve as a challenge for a new group of Christians, and a novel version of Christian nationalism began to appear. And she starts to talk about this here. And she says this: in 2022, Pastor Doug Wilson's Canon Press published Stephen Wolfe's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. But this wasn't the usual argument about a renewed need for the church to share the gospel, pray for revival, and uphold the cherished values and freedoms of our constitutional republic. No, she goes on to say this: Wolfe, leaning upon the Reformed theological tradition, advocated for a Christian prince to take the helm in the form of theocratic Caesarism. Under this system, he wrote that heretics and non-Christians would be punished with banishment, imprisonment, or the death penalty. Lest that wasn't radical enough, Wolfe opined on the importance of bloodlines in a nation, writing, "The originating source for one's affection of people and place is his natural relation, or his nation in the sense, those of his kin." And another section he wrote, "Here I will justify violent revolution." Again, let these figures speak for themselves. And we got a lot more that she's going to say here. But it goes on to say this: other like-minded Christian nationalists emerged as well. Among the most notable was Andrew Torba, founder of the social media site Gab, who released a book in 2022 called Christian Nationalism, co-authored with Minnesota pastor Andrew Isker. Another was former Trump official William Wolfe, now executive director of the Center for Baptist Leadership, an advocate for saving the Southern Baptist Convention, who served as a contributing editor to the 2023's Statement on Christian nationalism. She goes on to say this: 2 years later, this new breed of Christian nationalism has extensive tentacles into groups including Wilson's Media Empire and Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, the Claremont Institute, the National Conservative Conference, Blaze Media, American Reformer, New Founding, and the Society for American Civic Renewal. Some of what this crowd promotes is commendable, such as opposition to abortion, attacks on the family and LGBT ideology, and biblical positions that Christians largely support. But notice this is a key point, but scratch the surface of the Christian morality speeches and the picture grows darker. Although the factual details are too voluminous to list here, this movement as a whole is gaining a well-earned reputation for politically intolerant authoritarianism, white nationalism/kinism, hostility towards Jewish people and Israel, and advocacy against the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of free speech, a woman's right to vote, and even religious liberty, except for themselves. It's always except for themselves. And though its leaders and a band of followers would deny it, it's a close examination shows that this Christian nationalism is not a biblical movement at all. It is the flip side of the woke left. The new Christian nationalism is, in fact, a woke right. Now, what's interesting is, and we'll look at this here in a second, when I talk about this issue, I put this tweet up and I talked about, the woke left, in the sense, used to call everything racist until they controlled it. So, they want an institution, they want a school district, they want something. Well, you're a bunch of white, racist, patriarchal men, and they keep badgering and making that claim until people concede and give up whatever power that they have to these ideologies. And we know what they've been through: the diversity, equity, inclusion movements, kingdom diversity, Resolution 9 within the Southern Baptist Convention, and so much more. But the flip side of it is, well, how do we understand the woke right? What are they championing? And, I made this tweet and I said something under the effect of, these figures keep calling everything secular until they control it. So you can't have secular thinking. You can't have secular politics. You can't have this secular constitution. You can't have this secular fill in the blank. And they just keep filling people with this reflexivity about what is secular and how it's anti-God and how these are man's words and not God's words and all the rest. And, one other figure made a comment and he added to this, and it was Michael O'Fallon. And Michael O'Fallon said, is it just secular, and this is me paraphrasing, or is it this idea of liberal, calling everything liberal until they control it? So, the whole issue of classical liberalism, the United States Constitution was based off of classical liberalism. Liberalism is going to give you all of these different things as it relates to pagan drag queen society. So you either have pagan drag queen society from a post-liberal society, or you're going to have this ideology coming from Christian nationalism. Now, just forget the false bifurcations that they're giving there. Just forget the fact that they've given us just two radical alternatives, of which they're trying to have no distinctions in between, and there's no rational thought in between. Actually, maybe that is the key point. It is a false distinction. But what we have to see here is that they're using not arguments in this regard, they're using cliches. And another way that they do it, which is interesting, is that they're going to sometimes say, well, let's call everything BoomerCon until we control it. Let's call everything fill in the blank until we control it. And what's really interesting is that BoomerCon is very, very equivalent to calling everything bourgeois until you control it. It's very, very equivalent of when you call something secular, it's very bourgeois until you control it. It's very equivalent to whenever you say something is liberal in the classical liberal sense of the term, of calling it bourgeois until you control it. This is exactly how the totalitarian regimes have worked in the past. They use the types of sort of linguistic word game tactics in order to break down the will of people and sway the conversation in a particular direction. So let's pull this up here to look a little bit more at what she starts to say. First of all, she's going to talk about the fact that many of these figures are buying wholly into identity politics. The woke left stresses political activities that focus on the concerns of particular groups divided by identities, such as race or sex. Note this, the woke right also does this, basing its propositions for America almost solely on the concerns of white Americans, particularly males. Now, they also use this whole thing of the Mott and Bailey fallacy. And she goes on to say, this is a form of equivocation in which someone holds both to a modest position on the matter, the Mott, and a more controversial position, the Bailey. If the more controversial position gets pushed back, he backpedals to claim that he's only advocating for the modest position. And obviously this little video pops up here. We're not listening to it. On the woke left, this is evident with Black Lives Matter, as Craig Carroll points out, when the group is criticized for advocating on an issue like trans rights, the Bailey, it retreats to its mot that Black Lives Matter, a position he notes is then impossible to attack. And we've seen how this is played out constantly. You know, when these figures try to say that, you know, we want to teach little white kids what it's like to understand oppression and what it's like to be oppressed by different people. So we want to put chains on them and put them in the classroom, blah, 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 blah. And the mom goes, you're a crazy nut. You're not doing that to my kid. And they're really just saying, well, we just want to show what realistic, empathetic understandings of epistemology and learning process, blah, 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 blah. Mott and Bailey. Crazy equivocation games in which the extreme is really what they're pushing, but when they get pushed back, they walk it back. Note what Janet says here. She says, on the woke right, the Mott is stating Christian moral concerns. The Christian nationalist Bailey is the proposal to put heretics to death or to install a Christian Protestant Franco, a popular rallying cry on Christian nationalist social media. It is largely kept out of view, but when it's put forward and there's pushback, its leaders beat a hasty retreat to cries for Christian morality. And they do this all the time. You know, we merely want a Christian society that upholds our values. But what do those values look like when they actually put them into the writings? That's what we're going to look at more here in just a second. She goes on to say this. There's this clear understanding of the oppressor versus the oppressed model. Here, the woke left may state, and often does, that the oppressor is the white male while the oppressed are ethnic minorities. For the woke right, the oppressor is the non-Christian woke left versus the oppressed white American Christians, mainly males. In both cases, the solution is to reverse the oppressor and oppressed via a payback motivated power scheme. Now, she goes on to say that there's a disdain for God-given freedoms. The woke left has no problem saving democracy through big tech censorship of conservatives or the suppression of legitimate news stories. But the Christian nationalists of the woke right also have argued against freedoms under their utopian political scheme, including stripping the vote from women and banning atheists from holding public office. In addition to it, there's just this rising anti-Semitism. Note, she says this, radicals from the woke left have put their disdain for Jewish people and the nation of Israel on full display recently in the shocking pro-Hamas protests on college campuses. But anti-Semitism is also increasingly on prominent display from the woke right. Online, Torba criticizes, quote, the antichrist Jewish nation state called Israel, end quote, and has created a Hitler AI chatbot on Gab without Christian nationalist repudiation. Dozens of pro-Christian nationalism accounts on the same site regularly make anti-Semitic remarks. Blake Collins, author of the excellent book, which she endorsed, titled The Case Against Christian Nationalism, also revealed extensive evidence that a church in Wilson CRC denomination is rife with Christian nationalists or white Christian nationalists. Having considered the similarities between the woke left and the woke right, the question may arise, why even worry about a woke right when they have little chance of gaining the power that the woke left actually has? And that is an excellent question, because so many people have asked me, Bill, why in the world are you concerned with this? Bill, why in the world have you done interviews on this? Why have you written different articles related to this? Why have you spoken at different conferences about this? Why are you putting up with all of the pushback on Twitter and so on and so forth? And the reason is because, well, they are gaining some kind of traction. And if the arguments are put place, not only do I think that it's anti-biblical and contrary to the teachings of Scripture, I think it's going to have grave effects for all of the people who don't go along with it. Because mark my words, these people are going to, quote, have a good Christian society, except for those who didn't go along with them and who pushed back against this movement. In short, I'm afraid if we don't win, that the consequences are going to be more dire than what we're facing now. But notice what she says. First, the woke right is increasingly finding favor news coverage from large and trusted conservative platforms, including Fox News and Tucker Carlson, which can help legitimize this dangerous movement. You can add other figures like Charlie Kirk onto this. Blaze Media has been pushing this. You see a whole host of them in their large conferences like NatCon and so forth. Second, the woke right is both unbiblical and un-American. What right do Christians have to strip others of their God-given inalienable rights? Moreover, where does Scripture ever instruct the church to seize state power to force pagans to be righteous? As 2 Corinthians 5:21 reminds us, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. The only righteousness a sinful person can ever attain is through faith in Jesus Christ alone. Now, she goes on to say this: while Christians do need to be salt and light in our culture, the mission of the church is not to take over America and force it under a terrifying Caesar papism. Or as she might put it, until the Lord Jesus returns for us, we are to live godly lives, let our light shine before men, and fulfill the task of proclaiming the gospel and making disciples of all nations. As she ends here, President Reagan once said, the time has come to turn to God and reassert our trust in him for the healing of America. It is still as true as ever. That's why it's time for American Christians to denounce and reject the woke right of Christian nationalism and get busy with what the Lord has really called his church to do in this land of the free. So let's continue to look a little bit here, and let's play some videos and let's read a little bit more about what's going on with some of these figures. So as we transition here, I want to look at one of these articles that came out about who some of these figures are. And this is an article that came out from The Guardian. It says U.S. businessman is wannabe warlord of secretive far-right men's network. And this is talking about Charles Haywood. It's in many respects who's been labeled as Shampoo Soros. And it goes on to say this: the founder and sponsor of a far-right network of secretive, men-only, invitation-only fraternal lodges in the U.S. is a former industrialist who's frequently speculated about his future as a warlord after the collapse of America, a Guardian investigation has found. Now, one of the things that you got to find about him is that he's a University of Chicago trained lawyer who went into business after leaving the wonderful world of law, which I could totally understand. That would become just one of those almost like demoralizing, life-sucking things at times if you're just dealing with all of the cases that go on with that. And he found a better venture firm outside of it. But notice what they say here. Federal and state tax and company filings show that the Society of American Renewal and its creator, Charles Haywood, also have financial ties with the far-right Claremont Institute. SACR's most recent IRS filing names Haywood is the national organization's principal officer. Other filings identify 3 lodges in Idaho and Boise, Concord, Moscow, and another in Dallas, Texas. Sacker's public-facing presence is confined to a slick one-page website advertising the organization's goals as civilizational renaissance and a society with a strong leadership committed to family and culture. The site claims it is raising accountable leaders to help build thriving communities of free citizens who will rebuild the frontier-conquering spirit of America. It condemns those who rule today, saying that they corrupt the sinews of America, alienate men from family, community, and God, promising to counter and conquer this poison. And in that sense, these things all seem pretty good. But notice what they go on to say here. It says it also prominently features cross-like insignia or mark, which it describes variously as symbolizing sword and shield, and the rejection of modernist philosophies and heresies. Finally, the site advises that Sacker members is organized primarily around local groups overseen by a national superstructure and is by invitation only, offering an email address for those interested in learning more. The Guardian emailed the website contact address from a pseudonymous address, but received no response. Heidi Barrick is co-founder of the Global Research Project on Hate and Extremism and an expert of the far right. She characterized the rhetoric on this website as paleogenetic ultra-nationalism. a feature of fascism that proposes a revolution as a means of national rebirth. Now, that is a tongue twister for all of you who are going to make fun of me right then and there, but you would have trouble saying it too. Haywood has become a far more active and prominent as a blogger and commentator on the far-right podcast circuit since selling his solely owned Indianapolis-based shampoo manufacturing company, hence Shampoo Soros in this regard, to a competitor for an undisclosed amount in 2020. On his personal website, The Worthy House, where he styles himself as Maxim Leader, Haywood has written that the sale made him rich beyond the dreams of an avarice and looking to cause trouble. Mansfield King was reportedly on track to do $45 million in revenue in a year before its sale. Now, goes on to talk about things in its relationship with Claremont and other things with, other podcasts that are here, such as New Founding. It goes on to look at IRS dealings, and it goes on to look at all of the different business ventures that these figures are starting to get into. And one of the points, just to not belabor it here, is that this is a secret society that is using various funds to connect various groups. And, some of the things that they even look at here are some of the sponsorships that they're even getting into and some of the goals that they're having for disruption, dismantling, balkanization, and possible revolution that has taken place. Now, people say, this is absolutely crazy. Do these people actually believe such things? And the reality is, well, yes, they do. So what I want to do is I want us to start thinking about some of the ideas that are coming from this, and some of the different claims that these people are making is that we live in a post-constitutional era. So how I want to do this is I want to transition here, and I want to pull up. Let me switch these just a little bit so that you can see them, some of their claims. And we're going to move quickly through this because I know time is of the essence here. So this is one of these figures related to it. And this is Joel Webbin. And people are starting to realize, so let's summarize up to this point. They're the equivalent of the woke right. They want dominant power. They want to seize the power in these regards. They're making these crazy claims in this regard. But one of the driving things is that they think, well, we're post-constitutional. We do not need the Constitution anymore. It doesn't work for people such as us. So let's listen to a couple of the things that they have to say here real quick. Let's let them get it out.
We're degenerates. We're not even close to, we're degenerates. The Constitution is not, it's not suited for governing degenerates. For governing degenerates, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, if you agree, disagree. But I think for our population that is degraded morally and culturally, and religiously, as far as we have, you need power. Men must be governed. you need a Caesar type, Now, if you're asking me my preference, that would probably be my preference, would be a constitutional republic. But I think the conditions for that is a moral people. So I think you can work towards that in the future. But I don't think constitutioning even harder is going to get us out of our current mess. I don't see us getting out of this apart from things getting worse and worse, and then eventually like a Caesar type rising through the ranks, a populist, figure, and the people, the political will, the people are desperate and they're like, yes, do it, so and so, and then so and so, Constitution be damned, just rules with an iron fist, and like a Cromwell type, and then you hopefully don't get his son. Maybe then you're able, and then you maybe it's just a one generation, one guy kind of thing, and then you have to move back to aristocracy or some other form. We're degenerate.
And we know how Cromwell worked in the revolutions that took place in that regard. But what I want you to see is that many of these figures, they want to use these power dynamics to get into legitimate political power. And then they want to expand the rights of people in leadership in this regard to, quote, fix the paradigm in order to fix the problem. And note this, whenever government tries to expand the power of one individual, it never says that they're going to do exactly they never do what they say they're actually going to do. They never give up that power. They always keep that power. In addition to it, when these figures start to do these types of things, they never remain in power. But unfortunately, they've changed the rules in order for a new regime to come in and go even further in their ideologies of what they're doing. So, what's interesting is that you see the progressive left trying to do this, where they want to change, House and Senate rules. You see them wanting to stack the courts, the Supreme Court right now. We keep pushing back and saying, this is a bad precedent. And what I'm saying is, this is a bad precedent to have a Caesar-like figure come in to expand the power on the right, to bring in this authoritarian ideology that they want in order to, quote, fix the problem. When we know that they're not going to be able to fix the problem, we know the solutions that they're bringing about are going to bring greater harm than good. Now, the question that we also have to ask is that, are these figures post-constitutional? And I would say, yes, they're very post-constitutional. So let's just play this little clip here by Webben arguing the same thing again.
Episode of Theology Applied. I am your host, Pastor Joel Webben with Right Response Ministries. And in this episode, I am welcoming for the very first time to the show, Orrin McIntyre. He's a contributor with The Blaze. He's got a podcast. It's really good. You should check it out. And what we're discussing in this episode is why we should constitution even harder. Classical liberalism. Just kidding. Orrin is a realist, and by God's grace, so am I. And so we're not talking about that. What we're talking about instead is how America has not been a constitutional republic for a very long time. And if you think we are currently still a constitutional republic in terms of how we actually function, then I've got, some oceanfront property in Kansas that I would love to sell to you. It's time to wake up. It's time to grow up. A constitutional republic is wonderful, but we don't have it because that was designed for a moral and religious people. And currently, all we have.
The last I checked, each state has 2 senators. Seems like Constitution's still in place. Think about it.
Are a bunch of degenerates. So, can we get back to the Constitution? And if so, how? Or is this a storm that we just have to go through? And if so, what's on the other side? And are we prepared for that? That's the episode. I think you're going to like it. Tune in now.
So there's a lot of things that they say within this particular episode, but there's a few things I think you need to think about. The founders and the people during that time, guess what? I'm going to break this to you. They were degenerates too. The sinful heart of humanity is no different today than it was then. Now, society might look different. Yes, the sins expressed may be different. But what's really interesting is that when you look and you study early American history, you find many gross, immoral sins taking place during that time also. This view rightly recognizes the moral side of our society, but it wrongly assumed that some notion that society back then was less sinful. And they're going to say, no, we don't believe that. Clearly you do. Clearly, if that was a society that requires moral people and we're in a degenerate society and the Constitution could function within that particular society, you're saying it was a better society. And either it's the individuals were less sinful or the society was less sinful. So what I want you to see is this. Go read some of the sermons of the pastors and some of the legal cases people had to settle during that time, and you will realize that the human heart is totally depraved and full of degenerates at all times and all places. In fact, the checks and balances of the United States Constitution were given, one, because of the degenerate nature of the human heart, so that we can counteract what was going on with it. Two, they wrote it in such a way to split the powers in this regard, so that we didn't have this Caesar-like figure rise up and do these kind of particular things to individuals under the heading of a Protestant nation and a Protestant Franco. Now, it's not just him who's buying into these kinds of things. You have other figures that are saying these. For example, one of the other figures here who, this is just reading what is publicly put on here. He says this. He talks about, it's liberating to accept that we are political dissidents. If you are a committed conservative, your task appears hopeless. You must attempt to right a vast array of institutions captured by our enemies. friend-enemy distinctions, all while respecting established norms and hierarchies and arguing within the frame of debate they permit. If we instead recognize this regime must be replaced, we can focus on building and protecting our own networks and organizations unbounded by stifling establishment rules, because they're going to write new rules. We can watch incumbent institutions lose credibility on the face of their own stagnation and digital disruption, a transition that will leave most Americans seeking attractive alternatives. Hence, this is why figures are talking about parallel economies, how there's going to be this digital disruption and how they're going to fill the gap in this regard. He says, we are far from guaranteed to win the ensuing competition, but we have many advantages in that space. But notice this, related. The original U.S. Constitution was an impressive agreement, but it also bears almost no relationship to our present form of government. If we capitulate national level institutions, we can consider, if we recapture national level institutions, we can consider the reapplication of the original constitutional principles in the system of government we seek. But in the meantime, it makes little sense to obsess over long deal rules and norms when the immediate priority is building narrower alternatives and defeating leftist efforts to stamp out our way of life. So then you ask yourselves, when you consider some of these figures, what in the world do they mean by such things? What is this going to look like? So let's pull this up here, and we're going to switch to another document here. Bear with me. Christian nationalism. What might this look like? Let them speak for themselves. And this is from the now almost infamous book by Stephen Wolfe. Here we go. Bingo. And what you're going to see here is, in this particular case, we're going to be talking about this idea of compulsion of religion and what it's going to look like in society. Let's just read a few of these. The question is whether a Christian magistrate having civil rule over a civil society of Christians may punish with civil powers false teachers, heretics, blasphemers, and idolaters for their external expressions of such things in order to prevent 1. Any injury to the souls of the people of God, and 2. The subversion of Christian government, Christian culture, or spiritual discipline, and 3, civil disruption or unrest. Notice, suppressing false religion in one's own land can be called a holy war, for the intended effect is the elimination of sacrilege. In our time, the suppression of false religion is not an end in itself, but a means and matter of prudence. And such actions are prudent only if they conduce concretely to the good of the church. So what is this time period? What's this post-constitutional age and the recapturing of it going to be? First of all, it's going to be this idea of a holy war. And it's where if they gain power, this civil society that they want to have, there's going to be punishment with civil power, false teachers, heretics, blasphemers, idolaters, and more. They see this as their holy calling before God to create this so-called holy nation. Now, goes on to say this. Wolfe says in his book here, right here, as I argue below, false religion is a crime against God and it can cause harm to one's fellow man. Hence, one can reject the view that magistrates ought to punish the dishonoring of God and still coherently affirm that magistrates can restrain false religion in the interest of public good. All appropriate civil action against false religion is directed at its external expression in order to suppress external false religion and thereby prevent harm to the public, both to souls and to the body politic. Suppressing false religion is a means, not an end in itself. Thus, the question is not whether the suppression of external false religion by civil government is a good in itself or ought to be pursued for its own sake, nor is the question whether civil government ought to prosecute all expressions of false religion regardless of their consequences and circumstances, nor is the question whether civil power can force one to speak outwardly what is true, for that would cause one to lie. Note what this is going to look like. We can expect a Christian magistrate having an inscripturated clarification to understand the most basic principles of man's duty in natural religion and to know what clearly violates those duties, namely, 1, atheism, polytheism, and idolatry. 2, strange and profane rites. 3, blasphemy and sacrilege. And 4, the profanation of the Sabbath. These principles and their violations should be indisputable to a Christian magistrate, since they are known by natural reason and conscience and clarified in Scripture. Therefore, the Christian magistrate has good and confidence epistemic grounds to act against those to violate natural religion. And presumably, the Christian magistrate, though not a theologian, would be no regular Christian, but educated. He is therefore in a good and confident position to decide between disputes as to the fundamentals of doctrine. Thus, a godly civil magistrate will have competence to decide on what pertains to mere orthodoxy. So let's go on and look at what this might mean. One of those principles of the inclusion-exclusion is the primacy of Christian peoplehood. And so Christian nationalism will exclude at least the following from acceptable opinion and action, hence removing the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. 1, political atheism. 2, subversion of public Christianity. 3, opposition to Christian morality. 4, heretical teaching. And 5, political and social influence of non-Christian religion and its adherents. What about freedom of speech? Wolf states, of course, the range and topic of diversity allowed is a matter of prudence and collective experience. The purpose here is not to stifle public debate, but to maintain conditions for public debate to serve a Christian people. Public debate is a means, and as such, it ought to conduce to what is good. I affirm, therefore, that there ought to be a freedom of speech, and as with all societies and institutions, that freedom must be bounded prudently such that public discourse conduces to what is good. Mark my words, this whole idea of under the heading of prudence, they're not going to stifle public debate. They're clearly saying this in their other words. They're going to stifle public debate from the political atheists, the subversion of public Christianity, the polytheists, and so on and so forth. He goes on to say this, as I have said, the magistrate, as magistrate, has no interest in heretical belief itself as an inward error, but only public heresy. So as long as you believe it internally, they're not going to say anything. But the second you open your mouth, the public heresy, the outward expression of it, then they're going to come after you. The belief itself harms no one except the man who holds it, which is a matter between him and God. But public heresy has the potential to harm others' souls by causing doubt or distraction, or by disrupting public peace. The magistrate, who must care for the souls of his people, may act to suppress that heresy. The Reformed tradition has a long and widely acknowledged practice of ministers admonishing and disputing with heretics prior to magistrates exercising the sword. Note, arch heretics are publicly persistent in their damnable error and actively seek to convince others of this error, to subvert the established church, to denounce its ministers, or to instigate rebellion against magistrates. For this reason, they can justly be put to death. ... This is not to say that capital punishment is the necessary, sole, or desired punishment. Banishment and long-term imprisonment may suffice as well. So if you come up against them, if you become an arch heretic based off of whatever definition the public Caesar papist idea at the particular time affirms, you may fall under capital punishment. But if they're nice to you, they just might banish you. Well, where are you going to go? You're going to control the whole country. Well, they want balkanization. You're going to go to one of those other areas, or long-term imprisonment if you stay in one of their areas, and more. Note this. This approach clearly opposes the First and Second Amendments. The freedom of speech and the freedom of religion are not prioritized amongst this movement. Wolf and other Christian nationalists seem to wrongly impose the Reformed tradition as a standard on this topic. However, Reformed theology is marked by a commitment to sola scriptura, not a blind allegiance to any tradition, including the Reformed tradition. Moreover, Wolf wrongly assumes the few figures he cites represent the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition is much broader than the people that he is trying to advocate. And also, many Reformed theologians today disagree with Wolf's exegetical and theological underpinning. So what I want to do here is I want to switch back again. Boom, boom, boom. And I want us to look a little bit more at this particular podcast by Webben. And let's just listen to a few more of the things that they are putting forth. Namely, I want us to look at what his guest, McIntyre, has to say here about the Constitution and what the Constitution looks like today, and so on and so forth.
Constitution. Are we a constitutional republic?
No, we couldn't keep it, and that's a hard thing for a lot of people. When we look at the United States, I think that most Christians have gone ahead and substituted the Constitution for American identity. They said, well, we don't really know what to base our identity in anymore. We've had so many waves of immigration and transformation religiously and culturally and all these things. The only thing that can bind us together is the Constitution. So they've kind of deified the Constitution and the founders to make that the political theology that goes ahead and drives us as a nation. And because of that, they've made this kind of legal positivism the core of their belief in kind of who we are as a people. And so they've lost this understanding. Joseph de Maistre is a guy I like to pull from a lot. He was a French political theorist, and he talked a lot about what makes a constitution. And he explained that all constitutions are written by God. There's never been a constitution that's been written by men, because constitutions are only the reflections of the way of being of a people. The Constitution does not create people. People create the Constitution. It is simply an instantiation of what has already been written onto the hearts of people by generations and generations of traditions that God has placed amongst them. And so we never actually are defined by a constitution.
The Reformed tradition would utterly reject that. You're not going to tell me every constitution one was written by God. I hate to say it, guys. There's only one book that was theopneustos, and that is the Bible, not the Constitution. We don't believe the Constitution was divinely inspired by God. It was providentially given by God, but it's not something written by God. Come on, guys. We are inerrantists. Let's be inerrantists in that regard. In addition to it, there's no way you are going to tell me that all of the different constitutions, in their contradictions and in the different things that they put forth, are all from God. God says to avoid contradictions. The God who cannot lie. God is not double-tongued. He doesn't speak out of both sides of his mouth. If God is going to reveal himself, he is consistent with his nature, and his words are consistent with his nature. In addition to it, we're not going to have this idea that these different groups are somehow represented, even with contradictory morals, of the moral standards from God in that regard. I mean, seriously, come on, guys.
Constitution. It's only the words on the paper that are kind of formalizing what we are already doing as a people. And so the Constitution can never bind us together, because it's just a shadow of the people we are and the people we have to continue to be. And while we don't seem to know this in the modern world, the founding fathers totally did. They were very explicit about what the Constitution was. It was a document that was only capable of ruling a virtuous and religious people. And if we ever walked away from that identity, if we ever walked away from that kind of shared Protestant Christian understanding of what the nation was, then we would not be governed by the Constitution. And
no, these figures are interpreting the Constitution according to integralist paradigms. Namely, it's the idea that in order for you to have a right and just and ordered society, you must have some kind of religious archetype to grant that to us. And what they're going to ultimately argue for is that you need to have this union between church and state in order to have this just and ordered society. But ultimately, the state must enforce the religion that's undergirding this integralist union. And that's all the things that we just read from Stephen Wolfe in the Case for Christian Nationalism. This is the idea of what's going to come about with blasphemy laws and all the rest. And we're going to see exactly what this means in just a few instances here. So now what I want you to look at in this next section here, and we're just going to let it play, is I want you to see how they think we should govern degenerates. And note the things that they're going to look at here: power, Caesar-like figures, theonomy, Reconstructionist movements, how we can't get back to this without this Reconstructionist movement and the Caesar-like figure, that we need to have a national split, and so much more.
And we no longer are those people, and so therefore we are necessarily not governed by the document made for them.
Right. Yeah, Adams, right, was a moral and religious people. Yeah, we're degenerates. We're not even close to we're degenerates. The Constitution is not it's not suited for governing degenerates. For governing degenerates, and I'm curious your thoughts.
Except the fact, like we already said, that the Constitution was written by degenerates to govern degenerates in a degenerate society, and so forth.
On this, if you agree, disagree. But I think for our population that is degraded morally and culturally, as far and religiously, as far as we have, you need power. Men must be governed. you need a Caesar type, so for me, I would say if we're talking about, does the Bible prescribe?
Now let's think about this. They're going to say power is a good thing and everybody has power and governments have power. And they're right in that sense. God gives power to people and people can use that power for good or for bad. But let's remember what we're talking about. The woke right, calling everything secular, calling everything liberal, calling everything post-constitutional until they control it. And they already tell you what that power is going to look like in the quotes themselves, in what they're doing with the secret societies and the books that they have published and so on and so forth.
A certain form of government. There are guys in the theonomist camp, and I would be a general equity theonomist. Theonomy just means, God, theos, and it's just God's law. That's all it means. And so I am of that persuasion. That's, I believe, the confessional position both in the Westminster and in the 1689. A general equity theonomy, which means the moral law endures forever. Think 10 Commandments, Decalogue, Exodus 20. And then all these judicial laws, you're just extracting the general equity. What's the main moral? So parapet on the borders of the roof. Okay, well, we don't sleep on the roof because we have HVAC, but that means, to preserve human life, the dignity of human life. So seat belts and speed limits, whatever. So that's how we do it. So general equity theonomy, yes, I'm on board. But some of the old school Reconstructionist, theonomic, pure blood guys who I appreciate and respect immensely, they would go so far as to say that the scripture actually dictates not just laws, but a particular form of government. And they, of course, being guys from, the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, predominantly in American context, lo and behold, shocker, the type of government that the Bible absolutely dictates is a constitutional republic. And I would say, I don't know. Now, if you're asking me my preference, that would probably be my preference, would be a constitutional republic. But I think the conditions for that is a moral people. So I think you can work towards that in the future. But I don't think constitutioning even harder is going to get us out of our current mess. I don't see us getting out of this apart from things getting worse and worse. And then eventually, like a Caesar type rising through the ranks, a populist, figure, and the people, the political will, the people are desperate, and they're like, yes, do it, so and then so and so.
How did that work for the nation of Israel? Give us Saul. We want a king.
Constitution be damned, just rules with an iron fist, and like a Cromwell type, and then you hopefully don't get his son. Maybe then you're able, and then you maybe it's just a one generation, one guy kind of thing, and then you have to move back to aristocracy or some other form. What do you think?
Yeah, it can be very complicated.
So let's just think about this real quick. Let's go back and let's think about this for 1 second. Let's listen to what Peterson.
Often the easiest way to find out what someone's up to is just to listen to what they say. They'll tell you. Hitler told everyone what he was up to. He wrote a whole book about it. Oh no, he couldn't be up to that. It's like, yeah, pretty much he was up to that. These people who come out and say, We should burn everything to the ground and start again. It's like, that's what they mean. Oh, they don't really mean that. They don't mean that with equity. They don't mean equality of outcome. They don't really mean that. They mean it. They have sway online and far more.
They're telling you exactly what they believe. So let's come back here and let's start to look here what McIntyre with the Blaze has to say about this. Note, some of the things he's going to look at here is he's going to say that we're at the point where we need a Caesar-like figure. He's going to look at Joseph Maistre, and he's going to look at the fact that he's going to say we have not had a legitimate republic in a long, long, long time. And then also note what he's going to say here at the end about a national split.
When you look at the historical cycle of regimes, it would seem like we're at the point, as you say, where Caesar figure often rises. We're really in that moneyed oligarchical period of existence, and it feels like that you can feel that pressure building as to the only way through that, to cut through that Gordian knot, that gridlock, and kind of restore order, would be someone who could take the reins. But it really, of course, depends. Joseph de Maistre again said that every people will have a different form of government. That it's not that there is no right form of government, but it again will align with the way of being of the people. And no people is static. So the people will change over time. Their needs and desires and will change over time, and so therefore their governments will change over time. In the United States, we kind of do this little trick. See, we don't number our republics the way that, say, like France does. And so we pretend like we've had this.
No, they're not. They're going to say that we have not had a unified national republic. We've had multiple republics in the United States. We're just kind of lying to you about it.
One homogenous rule the entire existence of the United States. Of course, that's not true at all. We started under the Articles of Confederation. We dissolved those improperly. We didn't take a vote. We didn't follow the rules of Articles of Confederation. Our elites just said, all right, we're going to pass the Constitution now. And even inside the Constitution, we've had very radically different ways of governance. So, for instance, the presidencies of, say, FDR and Abraham Lincoln are very close to dictatorial. I mean, people don't remember that FDR literally stole all the gold in the United States. He just took it. He said, you can't own gold anymore. And he put it in Fort Knox. And we just pretended that's a normal thing that presidents do. We didn't declare that the Constitution was over. We just let the president steal all the gold. And then we moved on. And we pretended that we had the exact same government we had before. And so the United States has had strong men. They've had dictatorial, Caesar-like rulers.
And this is what they want again. Don't be fooled.
In our history. In fact, they're often the people we revere the most, despite pretending that we care very much about separation of powers and checks and balances and control of the executive office. It's not really the case. We kind of allow these people to rise as necessary. And so, as de Maistre predicted, we kind of allow our form of government to change in time, even though we technically keep the storyline, the continuity of the people, as if we've been one continuous republic this entire time. So will we see a formal change out of the Republican form of government? I don't think so, in the same way that Augustus did not formally change the Rome into an empire. No one came by and banged a gong and said, the Republic is done and now Rome is an empire. He simply slowly acquired the powers of the Principate and put them together. And a couple generations later, no one could imagine that, a Caesar didn't have all these powers, even though there was no formal declaration of, this imperial title for Augustus. He was simply the first citizen. And so I think that's probably the situation we're heading towards, assuming that America holds together as one political entity. I'm actually...
Notice what they're going to look at here. Notice what they see coming, what they think is going to come, and note some of the other things that they have said about how they're trying to get on the front side of what they're going to see as like a national divorce.
A little skeptical that will continue. But if it does, I don't think we'll see a formal announcement that we've moved to the American Imperium.
Right. I think that's fair. So talk about that for a moment. Talk about the nation splitting. What do you see as make your, go ahead and pull out your crystal ball and give us some predictions.
Well, a lot of people talk about national divorce, right? We hear this phrase thrown around a lot. Now, I'm skeptical again that we're ever going to get some official secession. I think the question of secession, for better or for worse, was kind of answered in the 1860s, and we're probably not going to see any official move in that direction. However, I think we can all feel that the competency of our current state is collapsing. We can feel that competency crisis and what's happening there. And it's also becoming very clear that states like Florida, that completely ignored what the federal government demanded that they do during COVID, fared much better than those that complied with everything that the central government demanded of them. We're also seeing this with things like immigration. We see guys like Greg Abbott and now probably Ron DeSantis with possible mass migration from people fleeing the Haitian Civil War being tested. Like, will you protect your state from an invasion? Because the federal government isn't doing it. In fact, they're actively importing it. They're facilitating it. Are you willing to take independent executive action? And as we saw with Greg Abbott when he started to lock down...
Okay, just for the sake of time, I want to switch here a little bit further, and I want you to see that these people are not only calling for a national divorce or recognizing that it's just going to happen even though it doesn't formally happen, and the people are going to start ignoring the federal government. He's even open to viewing different states as almost different countries. So let's just switch there real quick.
That we previously have thought about certain countries when it comes to missions. That, okay, these people, these places still need the gospel. They still need churches. They still need ministers. But we would look for certain qualifications. We wouldn't send just anyone, right? Like, there's 16 million professing Christians in California. I don't think all 16 million of them are missionary caliber. I think, that a lot of them probably should consider leaving, and then maybe Newsom finally has to lie in the bed that he's been making for years. Maybe he actually has to take a spoonful of his own medicine, that he's not bailed out. And maybe not, maybe that's ineffective. Maybe it doesn't work. But all that being said, to your point, echoing your point of, a lot of people are moving and balkanizing, some of the guys on Twitter, like, no, don't balkanize. Live near the coast to save that state and also go on a cruise and pay money.
Regardless, the point is they view these things as not just a balkanization, but eventually, he says, from a missiological aspect, we'll view them as different countries. But when you read their other literature, it's clear that it might actually end up being a different country. Whereas we want to have a unified nation. We want to keep all 50 stars on our flag and so forth. So let's continue here. And how I want to do this is I want us to look at who this figure is. Give me 1 second here. Because again, I use OBS, and OBS does not allow me to keep each window perfectly aligned and understood. So as we look at this, we got to get his portrait in there. If you don't have his portrait, you're missing the whole point. Who is this Joseph de Maistre? So notice this. This figure was a philosopher, lawyer, diplomat, and magistrate, one of the forefathers of conservatism. Maistre advocated social hierarchy and monarchy in the period immediately following the French Revolution. Despite his close personal and intellectual ties with France, Maistre was throughout his life a subject of the Kingdom of Sardinia, which he served as a member of the Savoy Senate, ambassador to Russia, and minister of state to the court of Turin. A key figure of the counter-enlightenment and precursor of Romanticism, Maistre regarded monarchy both as a divinely sanctioned institution and as the only stable form of government. He called for the restoration of the House of Bourbon to the throne of France and for the ultimate authority of the Pope in temporal matters. Maistre argued that the rationalist rejection of Christianity was directly responsible for the disorder and bloodshed which followed the French Revolution. So his point is that he's trying to argue that during his time, the French Revolution was given to this idea where people were based upon rationalist principles. So there's a whole bunch of things about his background and his life But what I want you to see here is that this is one of the key figures that these individuals are leaning upon. And when you look at some of the things, they want a monarchical view, of which it says here that it's this idea that no, for the ultimate authority of the Pope in temporal matters, this is the Christian prince. This is their idea. And you go, where does this stuff come from? Where you have this monarchy and the Catholic Pope reigning over this. It sounds very much like Catholic integralism, because many of these figures are quoting Catholic integralists. And in fact, many of these figures are justifying much of their post-liberalism, which they're going to look at here in a moment, under the guise of Catholic integralism. He was most likely educated by the Jesuits, who are some of the foremost integralist understandings of the day. But notice some of the influences here. Let's go down here just a little bit. His politics, the legacy, the reputation, together with the Anglo-Irish statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke, Mestre is commonly regarded as one of the founders of European conservatism. Mestre exerted powerful influence on the Spanish political thinker Cortés, the French royalist Maurras, and his nationalist movement Action Française, as well as the German philosopher of law Carl Schmitt. Hear that name before? Who's Carl Schmitt? You hear a lot of these other figures quoting Carl Schmitt. Who is this Carl Schmitt? The German jurist and political theorist and geopolitical prominent member of the Nazi Party? They are quoting one of the key figures as one of their key ideologues who was under Schmitt and influenced by Schmitt, the friend-enemy distinctions, the unbridled notion of the unbridled sort of figure, the unbridled CEO type of figure, this idea that has unbridled control to bring about the changes that must be given place here. What does this sound like? Carl Schmitt was also an integralist, interestingly enough. So now let's change here just real quick to continue a little bit more of what some of these figures may be stating. Let's look a little bit more at what Mr. Webben has to say about some of the true effects of this movement, for what it could mean for just the life of people in this country, some of the changes that they want to bring about. Note this. I'm trying to bring it up. I want you to see it. Some of the takeaways from the votes, November 4th, 2024. Look at this. Takeaways. Yes, women are more easily deceived than men. Yes, the majority of universities are merely institutions for deception. And yes, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was a bad idea. So what's this unbridled sort of CEO figure going to do? Take away a women's right to vote. So look at this now. Freedom of speech is gone. Freedom of religion is gone. Women's rights to vote are gone. And you say, oh, no, that would never happen. Well, guess what else we have here? We have, when we look at Webben, another video, this is exactly what he's calling for. Sorry for all these changes, but we're going to keep doing it.
Yeah, that's great. In the epilogue, let's talk about that for a moment. One of your portions in the epilogue, talks about being ruled by women, which I completely agree with you. I've said this on my show before, so I don't know, so that you're not nervous, I'll show my hand ahead of time and let you know where I'm at. But I've mentioned multiple times on our podcast that I think few things have caused more suffering than women's suffrage. So I I think that men should vote, and so that's my position with that.
In Aristotle's law of square of triangularity or square of opposition, if only men can vote, then women cannot vote.
I don't think that that's there's any problem with that, but I do think that it's extraordinary that we really do live in a society where even just the implicit laws, right, the cultural laws that aren't even civil laws, but just cultural guidelines and directives are they're all feminine. So anytime a man tries to take initiative and tries to actually carry out what God has called him to, taking dominion in his various arenas of life and the responsibilities that God has given to him, and as a husband, as a father, in his vocation, in his local.
So we could go on and on and on about this, but the point is this. I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I am a card-carrying complementarian. I'm not an egalitarian, but what these figures are pushing is just not complementarian. They're patriarchal. And the patriarchal understanding is that the husband is not only the height of the family, he's the sole and only representative of the family. Hence, he's the only one who should be able to vote because he's been given the discernment and all the rest. And women lack the ability and the discernment and the authority to vote in this present day system. This is what Christian nationalism is putting forth. Let them speak for themselves. So let's bring another little transition here. And let's start to look at this final concept just for the sake of time of what do they mean by post-liberalism. So post-liberalism, let's look at one of their articles here by one of the key figures that they seem to quote quite often. Bear with me. Patrick Deenan, Catholic, post-liberal. Note some of the things that he says here about classical liberalism and what is classical liberalism and what are some of the effects of it and so on and so forth. It says this: classical liberalism promised to overthrow the old aristocracy, creating an order in which individuals could create their own identities and futures. To some extent it did, but it has also demolished the traditions and institutions that nourished ordinary people and created a new and exploitative ruling class. The class's economic libertarianism, progressive values, and technocratic commitments have led them to rule for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many, precipitating our current political crisis. So classical liberalism is the grounds, it's the cause, it's the real cause of the effect of what we see today, so they claim. In regime change, they want to change what's going on here. Patrick Deenan proposes a bold plan for replacing the liberal elite and the ideology that created and empowered them. Grassroots populist efforts to destroy the ruling class altogether are naive. What's needed is the strategic formation of a new elite devoted to a pre-postmodern conservatism and aligned with the interests of the many. Their top-down efforts to form a new governing philosophy, ethos, and class could transform our broken regime from one that serves only the so-called meritocrats or meritocrats. Drawing from the oldest lessons of the Western tradition, but recognizing the change conditions that arise in liberal modernity, Deenan offers a roadmap for these changes, offering hope for progress after progress and liberty after liberalism. So these are a post-liberal society. Some of the things that this, quote, post-liberal society are advocating that we have to see here, and we're just going to pull up a couple of these again, is just a couple tenets. And you're like, oh, why would you pull from Wikipedia? Because it's actually giving us great resources on it. If you don't like it, go rewrite the article yourself. Here's a little bit. Post-liberalism is an emergent political philosophy that critiques and seeks to move beyond dominant liberal paradigm, or the dominant liberal paradigm of the late 20th and early 21st century. Proponents argue that liberalism, with its emphasis on individual rights, free markets, and limited government, has failed to adequately address societal challenges such as economic inequality, environmental degradation, social alienation, family breakdown, and a perceived loss of community and social cohesion. Post-liberals advocate for a more communitarian approach that prioritizes the common good, social solidarity, and the cultivation of virtue, often drawing on traditional and moral religious frameworks. They tend to be skeptical of unconstrained individualism, instead seeing individuals as more tightly bound up in the networks of obligations in families, communities, tribes, and faiths, and argue for a greater role for the state in shaping culture and promoting shared values. Post-liberal thinkers come from both the left and the right. The woke left, the woke right. Sounds really interesting. Both the left and the right say that we're in a post-constitutional age, and the movement is associated with a diverse range of ideas, including economic nationalism, localism, and a critique of liberal democracy. Now, it talks about a little bit here of the history. Post-liberalism has adherents from both the political left and the right. It first developed in the United Kingdom out of a movement with the Labour Party called Blue Labour. Early British theorists included John Gray, Maurice Glassman, Philip Blond, Adrian Pabst, John Milbank, and John Crudas. British post-liberalism remains a broadly center-left ideology which grew out of Christian socialism. However, in recent years, some factions within the Conservative Party have adopted elements of post-liberalism and national conservatism. In the United States, post-liberalism has become more influential among conservatives critical of the fusionist synthesis of free markets, hence they don't like free markets, and traditional values, which developed in the 1950s. Such figures as Patrick Deneen, Rod Dreher, Adrian Vermeule, as well as Israeli conservative philosopher Yoram Hazony. So here's one interesting thing that's really interesting about this whole movement. These figures get really, really, really angry when we will side with and work with a figure such as James Lindsay, who does not claim to be a Christian, claims to be an agnostic, somewhere in between with this. You can talk to him yourself. We know what he said out there. And they say, you guys are partnering with these pagan, non-Christian James Lindsay, blah, 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 blah. The key conservative thinkers that you're looking at on this, Yoram Hazony, who's a Jewish philosopher. So by their own criterion, they're working with non-Christians. They're working with people who don't follow the, quote, God of the Bible in this regard and all the rest. So stop with your virtue signaling and realize that truth is truth wherever truth is found. The objective nature of truth is the objective nature of truth. And if you guys can use it, we can too. In addition, don't even try to say, something like, well, we're building upon the historic Protestant tradition when you're looking at Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule, who are Roman Catholic integralists. Seriously, guys. So you can look at what they mean by some of these things. Their ideas of communitarianism and their free market exchanges and so on and so forth. Now, what I want to do here is I want us to look at something, namely, let's flesh out this idea just a little bit more. And people keep asking me, what's a good little video that's going to explain what is post-liberalism? And I want to play this video. It's a little long, but we're trying to make a resource here that you can use going forward. This is a video here, which we will cite in the bottom for the New Christian Intellectual, The Rise of Post-Liberal Thought. And this is going to be from a figure named Cody Leibold. Cody, I was telling some people, made the most excellent little short video on this, and I want to play it for your records here, just so that you can understand exactly what is being said.
What do you think about the rise of post-liberal thought in the United States today? How would you answer? I've been trying to follow what these people are saying, and they call themselves post-liberals because they have rejected classical liberalism. They believe that in the mid-20th century, after World War II, that the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States formed sort of even though they were opponents, they formed an agreement amongst themselves of shared premises. And those premises were an appreciation for classical liberalism and a conception that the United States government has a certain role in the world. So it's connected to neoconservatism and desiring to establish freedom and democracy throughout the world. And then it's also, in some ways, it's tied to this idea of progress. And while the leftist progressives would say progress means expanding more and more rights and those kinds of things, the Republicans also believed in rights and freedom as sort of a locus of what should be our political goal. And so then these post-liberals are coming in and saying, well, maybe this was a bad idea. We should reject it. Examples would be Patrick Deneen and Yoram Hazony. I believe they would all probably ascribe to this post-liberal idea, although they might call themselves different things like national conservatives. Some of them might even call themselves dissident right, which has some other associations, but they might be connected with it to a degree. But I would also challenge them and say, well, you think you're post-liberal, maybe you're pre-liberal. a lot of them seem to be advocating things that would have been considered common sense before John Locke, before that paradigm of classical liberalism.
I think that's one of the best comments that Cody made in this video. They think that they're post-liberal, but the reality is that they're pre-liberal. Well, what is the pre-liberal thing that they're pulling upon? Catholic integralism. Back to it.
So trying to understand what they really believe and what they stand for, I've read Yoram Hazony in depth, taking a lot of notes. Turns out Hazony, when he was at Princeton, started a publication called the Princeton Tory. Now this is a clue about what he believes. Somebody who focuses on individual rights, believes in the Declaration of Independence, would not likely start a publication called the Princeton Tory. So I consider him to be pre-liberal. I think that that's really his goal, is he wants to go back to before Thomas Jefferson, before the ideas of John Locke. And he really rails against John Locke in his book, Conservatism or Rediscovery. So understand, they tell you what they believe by their names. Now, in connection with Yoram Hazony, there's been...
Stop right there. They tell you what they believe by their names. Just like Jordan Peterson was saying, just listen to them. Listen to them talk. Listen to what they have to say.
In this National Conservatism conference, and they call themselves the New Right. An exemplar of that view would be Matthew Peterson. He is an integralist Catholic, but he's working with Protestants, and he formed this New Founding organization with them, and I don't know all the details of how they're related, but New Founding seems to have a whole bunch of publications associated with it, including American Reformer and another one called Align. And if you think about what they're trying to do, American Reformer is really not pro-American. If you read what they're talking about, if you look at the fact that they published Timon Klein, they actually are pre-liberals. They'd call themselves post-liberals, but they're pre-liberals, aren't they? I mean, they believe in theocracy. At least they're willing to publish those who do. They're willing to take it real seriously. They had this massive discussion of Stephen Wolf's book as if it was a book worth reading. So that's the landscape a bit. I mean, there's a lot more to it that I could say, but I want you to see they tell you what they stand for if you pay attention. So Align magazine, I just did a video about it the other day where they sent out an article saying that the Egyptian pyramids were a model for what we can do if we get past this older conception of the government being about preserving individual rights and liberties and begin to go back to a different kind of conception, which I think is even older, but it's the conception of the government as that which marshals the public resources and achieves good works. And so they champion these mausoleums of mediocrity, these ancient pyramids, as an example of the glory and splendor of what a nation can achieve if we all just pull together for the common good. Well, I got to thinking that their magazine is called Align, and they don't want you to align by choice, by donating to a project or by funding it with your business. They want to align you by the power of the state.
Did you hear that? Words have meaning. Magazine titles have meaning. This is exactly what they keep calling for in all of their literature. This is how they're going to push and advance their agenda with people under the quote Christian Prince.
So it's not you doing the aligning, it's them aligning you. There's another magazine from these post-liberals, and it's called Compact, a radical American journal or something like that. Sobram Amari, that guy that got himself famous by being the other end of the debate against David French. He started this Compact magazine, and I think he was originally associated with Yoram Hazony and the whole national conservatism thing, but I think they had a breach, something to do with a disagreement over national policy, foreign policy about Ukraine or something. Point being, though, these guys all have a certain set of shared premises. They want to reject the conception of government that the American founding fathers
Note this. Note this is one of the key points of the video.
believed in. They want to reject the Declaration of Independence and the ideals there, or at least they want to say, hey, we've been thinking too much about liberty lately. Let's downplay that. What we really need is a strong national government that is in charge of people's morals. It's going to be a vigorous, energetic government. Energetic is Yoram Hazony's word. So these post-liberals, they of course name their projects things like the American Reformer, which means we want to take America back to the days of the Protestant Reformation. Align, which means we want to align you by the power of taxation and by getting better people in charge, because obviously it's just our party needs to be in charge and we need more power. That would solve a lot of problems, wouldn't it? And then the Compact magazine, what is Compact about? Well, they don't mean a voluntary compact. They mean we think that philosophically, that the fact that we all live as human beings entails certain logical things that we must make a compact with each other. And the compact requires that the national government be strong and that it push people in their own interest in that direction. You know, I would name a publication something more like an agreement. Something that features this idea that we all think independently and come to the same conclusion, and those of us who have come to that conclusion can work together voluntarily. Contrast that idea with this idea of like harmonizing everyone by force externally. It kind of reminds me of in Atlas Shrugged, one of the villains created this weapon of mass destruction to use against his own population, and it was called the Thompson Harmonizer. What's the symbol? Is it the pyramids of Egypt? Or is it the Constitution? Cannot have both.
Very good video. Very, very good video. So I want to switch to our final section here. Note one thing that he talks about: national conservatism. Now, you might think, well, these guys are just for nationals and conservatives, and, you know, aren't they doing these? And we've seen them in the news recently, and we understand some of the things. But note who some of these key figures are at this movement. They have coming in here. Just look at some of these. Doug Wilson was famously put on there. Yoram Hazony. Just do a little research into some of these figures here. This conference that's coming up. But if you understand kind of some of the things that they're getting at, let's just watch their video.
Ready or not, national conservatism is becoming America's political majority.
And the reason I want you to do this is I want you to see this. I want you to know who they think are key figures. These are people who are post-liberals. These are people pushing I'm sure that's what they think. And I'm sure that's what they want you to do. And I'm sure that's where they're wanting to go with it. Let's finish with this. Our key thing that we looked at earlier. Let's understand exactly what he's trying to get at.
Often the easiest way to find out what someone's up to is just to listen to what they say. They'll tell you. Hitler told everyone what he was up to. He wrote a whole book about it. Oh no, he couldn't be up to that. It's like, yeah, pretty much he was up to that. These people who come out and say, you know, we should burn everything to the ground and start again. It's like, that's what they mean. Oh, they don't really mean that. They don't mean that with equity. They don't mean equality of outcome. They don't really mean that. They mean it. They have sway online and far more. Often.
So the goal was for you to see exactly what they believe in their own words, to understand the dissident woke right. Because we know where they're moving. I think Cody nailed exactly where they're coming in this post-liberal thought. We've recognized that they are Catholic integralists, that they're not just post-liberals, but they're pre-liberals. And you have to see exactly what they're wanting to do. They're wanting to do away with individual rights, individual liberties, and the free market concepts that America was founded upon. So again, thank you. Think for yourself.
Your rights are my responsibility. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. And I'm not listening to your stupid classes.